Hello, I'm Sukat and welcome back to the second channel video. This one is going to be about maps and statistics, two things you've probably worked out that I like by now, and they eventually will all relate to where I am today, which is Minnesota. To be precise, the capital of Minnesota, St. Paul. It looks pretty nice this morning, doesn't it? But yeah, let's talk about the two fun facts about American ancestry that are really important to know, because the first one is oftenly, said in America and is technically not true, even though it kind of factually is, and the second one is factually not really that true. No one knows it and no one really thinks it, and it's not really true, but on a technical level it is. So let me explain both those facts, because the first one is the fact that here, in Minnesota, the reason that they're so good at hockey, or the reason they love the cold so much, or whatever, the thing that people cite this to, is because of the fact that most of them are descended from Swedish people, or they're descended from Norwegians, or Scandinavians as a whole. You'll hear something along the lines of that. And the second fun fact, and this is the really shocking one, is the fact that if you ask Americans to list their country of ancestry, their country of origin, the country they were from before America, assuming they're not Native Americans, the number one country you get, you'd figure like, oh, Great Britain, right, or the UK. No, the number one country is German. That's right, most Americans are from Germany originally. And again, that's technically true, but it's factually kind of not. Although if you want to see another kind of fun fact, here is a map with, in case you think that the numbers are just kind of messed up, here's a map showing it state by state. And as you can see, when you go to state by state, it's like, wait, most states have German ancestry, and the ones that don't, they're not British either. There's like free English, which is like Utah and Vermont and stuff. But most states are like either Germany, and if it's not Germany, it's like, oh yeah, African American, and if it's not African American, it's like Native Hawaiian, or like there's a lot of weird examples, but most people are not from the UK or from Great Britain. What's the deal with that? And the simple answer is that in the latest census, they stopped just asking for a European country, and they started letting you put America as your country of origin, and that's for people that aren't Native American. That's just for people who are like, I've been here so long, I'm American, which honestly I kind of get, but it does then mean that people who just consider themselves to be American are kind of writing themselves off the rest of the list. And given that, again, German Americans have the proud kind of heritage thing, but there's not really such thing as a British American, right? Like, think about it. When you dig down into the classifications of like what an American is, there's like African American, Italian American, even German American, like you say sometimes, but mostly speaking, no one ever's like, oh yeah, I'm a British American, an English-American. That's not a thing that happened. Maybe because we were the majority for so long in a lot of places, but maybe that's not the thing. But yeah, I found it, that's the basic reason, the fact that now American is a category, which means that Kentucky is made up of Americans, even though, again, Native American, very different things. That's the reason why that Germany makes the majority, because basically the Great Britain or the UK thing is split into multiple choices, and not just in terms of like, oh yeah, English versus American. There's also in terms of English versus at the time the UK, at the time of I guess owning America for the little phase that we did. At the time, Ireland, also a big category. They're one of the largest categories. Irish Americans, it's a thing, right? At the time also, and also in terms of the numbers at least. Even though the UK is one country today, there is 4 separate ancestries for it. There is Scottish, there is Welsh, there is English, and there is Scots-Irish. And when you add all those categories up together, suddenly it makes sense, and oh yeah, there is a UK majority after all, and that's the reasoning behind that one. But still, it's fascinating the way that the statistics are designated, because it also means that even if we ignore like the whole like, oh yeah, so what's the deal with like Germans and versus like British people, who's the majority in America? Well, as it turns out, like again, it's kind of like debatable between the two of them, but it's also interesting that if you look at, again, into the numbers where you see like where Welsh is, where you see where Scottish is, also there's like snow below me, I hope you can't hear it too loudly. It's very snowy here, but if you look into that big list, you find a lot of other categories where you're like, oh, I guess they emigrated from there too. And the truth is, pretty much every European country, with very, very few exceptions, had large amount of emigration to America, including Sweden, which again, we'll come back to where we are today, including all these countries. And I thought there was quite a few interesting examples, because they generally settled in one particular area. So for instance, although Germans settled mostly in like the kind of Midwesty area. Chicago had a huge German population. The area around this, again, let's just say the Midwest for now. That's the reason for it. The most interesting thing is the fact that in North Dakota, German Americans make up almost the majority. It's like 46.5%, and then there's like a lot of Russians there too, Ukrainians and stuff. And what I find fascinating is the Germans that went to North Dakota and South Dakota, let's just say the Dakotas, for simplicity, because who even really needs them to be 2 states? But So the interesting thing about the Germans that went to the Dakotas, as opposed to, Germans from elsewhere, who were just from the German Empire as a whole, they're actually not Germans from Germany. They're ethnically German, they spoke German in some amount, but they didn't, emigrate from Germany, they emigrated from Russia. That's right, they're Russian Germans. The people that are from, in the Dakotas are mostly descended from Russian Germans, or Volga Germans, Black Sea Germans. There's a bunch of terms for them, but basically, before the World Wars, there were Germans all over Europe, and in particular, Russia, because they always had a problem with technology and agriculture. They just invited a bunch of Germans to come over in the 16th or 17th century, or 1600s or 1700s, so 17th or 18th century, and then eventually later they're like, actually, I don't think we like having Germans in our country, and they put a lot of pressure on them to kick them out. So a lot of them fled from Russia, figuring like, yeah, we're emigrating anyway, let's just go all the way to America, because again, during those centuries, America was just known as like the place where you can make it, and I mean, like, probably still true to this day, right? So yeah, the people from the Dakotas are not the same Germans as the rest of the Germans from elsewhere, and I find that to be a fascinating little story. But also, if you look into, for instance, Danish Americans, you can find there's a huge concentration around Utah, because a lot of Danish people ended up being Mormons, and they decided, we'll go to Utah, where that's the land. So they went there before it was a state, eventually became a state, and now there is a lot of Danish Americans in Utah. If you look at, like a lot of Polish people near Chicago, if you look at pretty much any ethnicity from Europe, they all kind of settled in their own distinct area of the US. So again, if we look at Finnish people, a lot around, Minnesota, a few in Dakotas, a few in Nebraska. If you look at Swedish people, same kind of story, Minnesota in particular. And I find that interesting because then and then if we, use Mexico as a country, even though it's not European, you'll see how like the Western states, the ones that used to be, kind of Mexican and still have Mexican names, like Los Angeles. That's the city, not a state, I know. But for instance, if you look at those states, got a high Mexican proportion, and it made me actually realize something big about America. Like, because the whole system of states is sold as like, oh yeah, we love self-governance and local governance in America. But it actually strikes me when you realize just how diverse the ethnicities are. Again, here in Minnesota, the state population is hugely made up of like Swedish people, then Finnish people, then Norwegian people, and then some Germans, and then stuff like that. If you go to the East Coast, New England, mostly made up of English people, Irish people, Scottish people, etc. If you go to the South, it's mostly made up of African Americans. If you go to, the West, it ends up being mostly made up of people from Mexican origin. So when you realize that there is huge diverse populations in America, people say it's the melting pot, but the truth is depending on where you live, although there's a local melting pot, it's a different melting pot for every single state. There's a different, or every single region at the very least, again, depending on which map you look at. And looking at every single one of these maps just made me realize that, wow, it's kind of like how European countries, so for instance, think about Spain and Catalonia. Catalonia has a huge amount of autonomy within Spain as a whole. They can make their own laws, they've got their own language, etc. And because they're very different people, what a lot of European countries do, and what a lot of countries do around the world, is they give huge autonomy when there is different races and different peoples. Think about Serbia, with how Kosovo used to be, or with Vojvodina today. When there is like hugely different peoples in an area, a country gives them autonomy. And that's kind of what America does with states, right? Again, whether intentionally or whether not, there is huge differences between states and their populations and what they choose to do, and that's kind of one of the reasons why there's so much autonomy. And if that sounds like kind of BS, then think about Minnesota. Again, high proportion of Swedish people, high proportion of Finnish people, high proportion of Norwegian people, which for the reason they all came here is because, again, like there was big crises and crises is technically the word, but there was big crises in Sweden at the time, a little bit in Norway. They just figured like, let's emigrate anyway, and they really liked it here because the land was cheaper and it reminded them of home. It was nice and cold. It's a little bit Nordic in terms of the temperature. So basically all those people emigrated here, right? And because it's made up of mostly Swedish, Finnish and Norwegian people, who are today known for being very, I guess, welfare state, like the model of like Scandinavian social democracy is like a common one around the world, or it's commonly known around the world that like they do quite well from there. Well, think about it, here in Minnesota, they kind of have a version of that. This is one of the few cities I've ever been to with not only public transport, like that works, but public transport that white people used to, and that is affordable, like free things all at once. I don't think I was meant to say that second one, but it's true. Like, wow, they actually use it here. And there's a lot of like social stuff that has to be done, like they plow the roads immensely, really well. All these big things they managed to do here, and they have like kind of their own, like, I guess the best way to put it is like their own little Scandinavian, you know, like a thing going on here. It's very similar to a Nordic country. There's some differences because of the federal level, but that's kind of different. If you think about all the different regions, it kind of matches how things are, and that made me realize that you're not Minnesota, you know, because when you think about you know, other countries and their autonomous areas, they're kind of like their own little countries, right? Again, people get offended if you say Catalonia is kind of like a country, or if you say like, you know, like anything else is kind of like a country besides the UK, where you're allowed to say Wales and Scotland are countries. But you know, you know, in the same way that these autonomous areas are usually considered kind of countries, I think the American states are kind of like their own little countries. They have diverse, different rules, diverse populations and stuff like that. And maybe this is a big obvious thing for everyone, but to me it's not. So what I'm saying today is because they have really well funded public transport, because you know, their team is called like the Vikings, right? I don't know what sport it is. Basically, I'm saying that Minnesota can be a Nordic country, and that's why their flag right now, which sucks, should be changed. And in fact, there's a proposal to change it to this flag right here. That's right. If you like, I really love Scandinavian countries. I love Norway. I would live there if I could afford to, but I definitely can't as a YouTuber at least. I love Scandinavian countries, and all the things I love about those countries, I find right here. It's got a little bit of an American twist on it, but it's basically, Minnesota is a Scandinavian country, and you learn that when you dig into the fact that most Americans are Germans, because most Americans aren't Germans, unless you're in North Dakota, in which case they're Russian Germans, and I don't know what the point of today's video is, but Minnesota is a Scandinavian country, and if you like Scandinavia, then you should visit the newest bunch, because they have Icelandic people here, I forgot to mention, Minnesota. So, thank you very much for watching today's video. Again, I actually have somewhere to be like in 20 minutes, so I've got to go rush off, because that's the reason I'm here for a convention. But thank you very much for watching. Second channel, don't care, goodbye. Oh, it's a new phone, so tell me what you think of the quality, because it's meant to be focusing on my face, but bye.